We're going to continue our Jewish journey through the book of Acts, our Acts, facts, narrative. But before we make new ground and trod new paths, let's be certain that we are familiar with where we have been. Let's recap. Previously, in Acts, facts, a Jewish journey through the book of Acts, we met the procurator of Judea by the name of Antonius Felix. Felix, not the cat, but the procurator. And we saw how he had Paul in his under his auspices, the auspices of his hospitality, in the Herodian Praetorium, the Herod's Praetorium, in the capital of Judea, Caesarea. These are the ruins that you see jutting out into the Mediterranean Sea today. If you come to Israel with us, and you will see this for yourself. You see the area that is square right there to the left. That is the area, the administrative area, and most likely part of the area where Paul was imprisoned during this time. It wasn't prison, but it was a very serious under guard and house arrest. But he had visitation and Felix, and he would have discussions, you'll remember. And we covered chapter 24 last week, and this high priest and Ananias with the lawyer, the attorney named Tertullus, and bringing charges from Jerusalem before Felix, the governor, against Paul. We saw the trial, and we saw that there were three accusations against Paul. One is that he was a public pest of international influence. Number two, he is the ringleader of the Nazarenes, that Jewish sect that believes in Yeshua. And the third accusation was he was a profaner of the temple. As you can see, these are all Jewish religious charges, and not much that Rome could do about it from a civil perspective. And Felix told them, I'm sorry, I will make up my decision. I've heard your report, I've heard your testimony, I've read your complaint. Go home to Jerusalem, and I will make a decision regarding what to do with my prisoner. And the thing is that Felix didn't make a decision. The scripture seems to indicate that he prolonged Paul's imprisonment because he thought over time he might be able to receive a bribe. Paul has demonstrated that he is a prodigious fundraiser, and Felix is a politician, like so many politicians, always has at least one handout at any given time, and he would have many conversations with Paul, not regarding a potential bribe, but regarding Paul's faith and what the Bible teaches. Because he was married to a Jewish princess, after all. Not Paul, but Felix was married to Drusilla. She was the daughter of Agrippa the first, the brother of Agrippa the second, who is presently the king, is the Herod of that day. And he is also, we're going to meet also his sister-in-law momentarily by the name of Bernice or Veronice, Veronica, which we get the name both Bernice and we get Veronica as well. Those are all from the same name. Nonetheless, Felix would have many conversations, but he got spooked. He got the willies over three subjects that Luke mentions that Paul brought up in their talks. first was righteousness, the second self-control, and the third the judgment to come. The righteousness that God requires is not always in line with the righteousness of a pagan culture. And as far as self-control, Felix very clearly had very little self-control, and therefore any coming judgment from God or any higher power would have given Felix pause. Eventually, Felix is actually going to experience a judgment. His judgment to come comes in 59, 7 years after he is installed as procurator, 2 years after meeting, roughly 2 years after meeting Paul. His judgment to come comes from Nero. He is recalled for mismanagement. There are too many problems percolating in the area of Judea. Remember, he is recalled in 59. This is where we are today, 59, which is a mere 7 years from the time that full-out revolution, rebellion breaks out throughout all Israel, winds up being a war that lasts for 7.5 years, eventually resulting in the destruction of the temple. So Felix is at the beginning of this period of heightened tension, and he winds up being recalled and has to go face Nero, and a replacement comes in. We'll see him soon enough. Verse 26 of chapter 24, before we get into the new material in chapter 25. At the same time, too, he was hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to send for him quite often and converse with him. Just nothing that made Felix too uncomfortable. But finally, to make up for his treatment of the people under his control, over his command, specifically the Jewish community in the capital in Caesarea, Felix decided on the way out to do the Jewish leadership a favor before leaving office, and that was to leave Paul to languish in prison. Felix had everything he needed. He could have dismissed him. In fact, after a lengthy period of time, almost 2 years, and there's no more charges brought up, and this case is going nowhere, as a Roman citizen, it would be most likely for Paul to have been released, the case to have been dismissed, but Felix does not do so. But nonetheless, this 2-year period of time gives Luke's steadfast companion, Luke, an opportunity to travel up and down throughout Israel, throughout Judea, throughout the Jewish community, the believing community specifically, to gather eyewitness personal testimonies of the stories regarding Jesus, the history of what happened with Jesus. And it is at this time that Luke compiles everything he needs to do to publish the Gospel of Luke. And I suspect gathers a great many of the stories about the early days of the church as well that he includes in the first portion of the book of Acts. Well, Felix is recalled. See, recall is nothing new. We didn't invent it. Felix was recalled. He's replaced by a fellow by the name of Porcius Festus. Not Fester. He's the uncle from the Addams family. But this guy's name is Porcius Festus. Porcia Festus. And after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul imprisoned. Let's meet Festus. Surely there is a great deal that history records regarding Porcius Festus, and Josephus, of course, must be chock full of information. No. We know that he ruled from 59 to 60. He replaced Felix, 59. And then he dies in office, 62, a mere 4 years prior to the destruction or the beginning of the Jewish revolt, a mere 8 years prior to the destruction of the temple. And there's very little other information regarding the procurator. But the political situation in Judea was volatile enough that Porcius Festus takes only 3 days. He's appointed, takes him 3 days, which is very fast, to settle into his new headquarters in Caesarea before meeting with the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. So he makes the acquaintance of the high priest in Jerusalem. This is not the previous one who slapped Paul. This is a new one by the name of Ishmael. He meets Ishmael's colleagues on the priesthood, the Sadducees. Now, Festus is immediately set upon with a renewal of the charges against Paul. Festus then, having arrived in the province, Judea, 3 days later, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul. And they were urging him, requesting a concession, urging Festus a concession against Paul that he might have Paul brought to Jerusalem at the same time, setting an ambush to kill him on the way. Now, Felix knows quite a bit about the way. Not the way, the road to assassination, but the way, the early church. Felix knew a lot. Festus, however, completely ignorant of Christianity, of the faith, of Messianism, of the Messianic Jewish belief. The Jewish leadership, nonetheless, they prevailed upon their new procurator, Porcius Festus, for a favor. They want Paul transferred from Caesarea. He's pretty secure in Caesarea, in the holding pen in the palace of the governor. But the Jewish leadership requests that Festus have Paul transferred to Jerusalem. Remember, he had to be brought out of Jerusalem with half the garrison of the Antonia fortress to protect him, because he would have been assassinated on the way. So he needed that extraordinary armed guard, and he was delivered to the security of Felix. But now the Jewish leadership wants to go backwards. And they know Paul's safe there, and they're getting tired of waiting for Paul to be taken out of the security of Caesarea, and they want him brought to Jerusalem because they're going to have him assassinated along the way. They want to fulfill their conspiracy, ambush their enemy while he's on the road to the holy city of Jerusalem. Festus then answered, and Paul is being kept in custody at Caesarea. I don't think Festus is ignorant here. I think he's trying to protect his reputation, maybe not Paul per se, but he wouldn't want any blemish on his new confirmed position. So Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in Caesarea, and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore, Festus said, let the influential men among you go there with me. If there's anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. In other words, I'm not taking Paul to Jerusalem. I will go to Jerusalem, and I'll take back a delegation. And if you want to have another trial, back in Caesarea, we can do that. You got a problem? Let's do it in the courts in Caesarea. After he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea, just like this, again going north to Caesarea, but down from Jerusalem, geographically. And on the next day, wasting no time, Festus, he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. So Paul is going to undergo yet another trial. Now, this time the Jewish leadership did not bring their slick lawyer, Tertullus, right? But once again brought a pile of 2-year-old charges against Paul, none of which could be proven. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. Sometimes you hear charges and accusations that are thrown around in culture, in particular cases or in culture. You hear things that, while they are passionately articulated, they're illogical and make no sense. Right? So just because you say something with passion often enough and you think it's true doesn't mean that it is true. So like these charges that are being brought once again against Paul, they don't get any more true by being around for now 2 years. But Paul responds to each major charge that is thrown at him, and he avows his innocence. While Paul said in his own defense, verse 8, I have committed no defense. Okay, and here you see, here are the areas. I haven't committed an offense against the law, Torah, in other words. Same old, right? It's a religious charge. What does Porcius Festus have to do with that? I haven't committed an offense against the Torah of the Jews or against the temple of the Jews. That was, again, the major issue. Oh, he transgressed the temple. It wasn't true when they originally accused him. It's still not true. And in fact, it hasn't gotten more true by the fact that Paul couldn't even go back to the temple because he's been stuck in jail. He's been stuck in prison for 2 years. So I've committed no offense against the law of the Jews, Torah, or against the temple, the Jewish holy place, or against Caesar. So this is apparently where they thought they were going to get him this time. They were dismissed. The charges were dismissed on being all religious, but now they brought charges against him, against Caesar. So when exactly did Paul plot and involve himself in get involved in this new charge, this insurrection against it? He's been in jail. Not a lot of insurrection that you can perform while you're in jail. Not a lot of political chicanery that can go around when somebody's stuck in jail. See, Festus very clearly winds up being aware of Paul's innocence, just like Festus. But Felix, who wanted a bribe, Festus didn't want a bribe necessarily, but he lacks the courage, being new on the job, to risk offending the Jews with an acquittal of Paul for lack of evidence, or evidence that just simply doesn't stand up to facts. And so, Paul is no fool. Paul is not going to allow himself to be pushed around. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, I'm getting tired of this. I'd like to pass the buck as quickly as possible. Read between the lines. Wishing to do the Jews a favor, again, wishing to establish get off on a good footing with a good step with the Jewish people. Festus answered Paul and said, okay, you're so sure of your innocence. Okay, I take that. Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? Would you go, in other words, to the Antonia fortress and we'll have a trial there? And again, Paul, being no fool, knows, no, I had to leave the Antonia fortress under cover of night. I will not survive. There are assassins on the road. There are traitors against me everywhere, people who want to see me dead. It would be stupid for me to go to the Antonia fortress, even though I am certain of my innocence. What is one to do when after almost 2 years you've been deprived of justice under the hospitality of 2 separate procurators, stuck in jail, 2 trials, both of which went nowhere? He realizes there's no chance that he's going to receive justice in Jerusalem, death only. And maybe no justice in Caesarea. In the likelihood that, the unlikely event basically that he would be able to avoid assassination in Jerusalem, how long would Paul be able to stand before the Sanhedrin without them taking matters into their own hands? The odds of surviving a second confrontation with the Sanhedrin, first time he was able to turn the tables on them and do jujitsu against them, emphasis on the Jew-jitsu. Yeah, you see what I did there? And turn their theological arguments against, but he's not going to be able to get away with that again. Paul figures it's going to be probably the case that Festus is either too weak or too inexperienced to safeguard Paul. So the apostle says, no can do. As a matter of fact, how dare you abdicate your responsibilities as a Roman procurator and a man who is responsible to Rome for your office? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal. How dare you try to pass the buck? It is here in Caesar's tribunal, of which you are the representative of Caesar. I want what's coming to me as a citizen of Rome. I ought to be tried here. I should have been tried simply before Felix and acquitted. I was not. I should be tried before you. Don't ship me. I will not be shipped back to Jerusalem. If you're not going to do this, I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you yourself also very well know. This is where I think that Festus is weak. Paul calls him out. You know, but because of political exigencies, you're afraid to do what's right. Wow. This is the last time you saw a politician who knew what the right thing was to do, but was afraid because it might get bad press, or he might lose a few donors along the way. Festus, just one politician like many. They haven't changed in 2,000 years. So a drastic measure is called for. Festus, who is literally sitting on the tribunal seat, the Roman judgment seat. He's sitting there as judge. If he would not exercise his authority because of the fear of the people, then Paul would go over Festus' head. And he would demand the Roman justice that was due him from the highest possible authority. If then, Paul says, I am a wrongdoer and have committed if I'm a criminal and I've committed anything worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. Remember, for Paul, to live was Christ, to die was gain, Philippians. I don't refuse to die if I've done anything wrong, worthy of death. But if none of these things is true, of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Paul invoked his right as a Roman citizen and appealed to Nero, to Caesar, for justice. This is Nero. Not literally, it's a representation of Nero. Yeah. It's three-dimensional and two-dimensional. There he is. Okay. What a profile this guy had. I appeal to Caesar. To which Caesar responded, I'm not sure that I agree. I don't find Paul that appealing, frankly. I appeal to Caesar. No, you don't appeal. Then you're not my type at all. But no, he was speaking in a legal fashion, raising the stakes and appealing to a higher court, the highest court in the land. Talk about your Supreme Court. And indeed we should. But since 23 BC, the Roman citizens, in other words, for the past 80 years or so, Roman citizens throughout the empire had the right to request trial in Rome with the verdict to be determined by the emperor itself. It's an appeal. Right? And in appealing to Caesar, Paul's not really entrusting his care to the whims of this awful emperor. He's entrusting his fate to the care of the Lord. Remember, it's Jesus himself who promised that Paul would witness in Rome. But 2 years had passed, and Paul remained immobilized. There were souls to be won. There were cities to be evangelized. There was good news to propagate, churches to strengthen, believers to encourage. And he was stuck in Caesarea. I mean, granted, the view is lovely. Mediterranean Sea is lovely at any time of year. But Paul has work to be done. Time's going by, and at this point, he's already 54 years of age, more or less. Not a spring chicken in those days, as opposed to today, where 54 is or 57, it's new 37, I hear, or at least I tell myself. But he wasn't getting any younger, point is, and what he had, turning the world upside down, it's not a senior citizen's game. His best years, the prime of life, was fleeting. It's high time for Paul to act while he could, to assist the Lord in fulfilling his promise that he actually speak before kings and testify in Rome. When Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, "You've appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go, my hands are tied. You want Rome? You got it. Now it's Festus. Thorny responsibility to navigate through strange and unfamiliar Jewish customs and issues in order to formulate some kind of charges against Paul that he could send to the imperial court for a trial. That's his job now. So Festus, to get this done, he enlists the aid of a colleague better suited, better educated, more experienced in Jewish matters, and that's the Jewish king of whom I mentioned earlier, the brother-in-law of Felix, King Agrippa II. Now, when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and his sister Bernice, Veronica, Bernice, we'll just call her Bernice, arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. Now, Judea is not Agrippa's territory, but he is the ruler. Agrippa is the ruler of the northern territory above Judea and surrounding Judea, and his sister as well. Let's deal now with a double biographical moment. This, it's hard to see. The coin on the left is young Herod Agrippa. This was actually minted by his father, Agrippa I, regarding his son, Agrippa Jr., or Agrippa II. And this is, it's hard to see what he looks like. His complexion doesn't look so great with that coin being as it is, but that's what we have. Now, regarding Agrippa, there's a lot that we know about Agrippa II. The second. He's the grandson of Herod the Great. You remember Herod the Great, the guy who built the temple, the guy who killed the Jewish babies in Bethlehem. He's the son of Agrippa I. Agrippa I, that's his dad. That's the one who was eaten by intestinal roundworms when he accepted the praise that belongs to God, the voice of a God, not a man, right? And in Caesarea, it drops dead several days later in agony. He is the brother of Drusilla, that's Felix's wife, brother-in-law of the prior procurator, Felix, and obviously the brother of the other sisters, Bernice. Is granted control of his kingdom recently, because he's still a young man. His father died, and he was like 15, I think, when his father died. So he's still a young man in his 20s at this point. He's granted authority over the temple and the priesthood, in addition to a certain level of property. His territory extends all the way up to Caesarea Philippi. Those of you who've been to Israel, you remember that's where Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That's where that happens, right? He's viewed by the Jewish people, however, as a Roman puppet. And it's a fair suspicion, because he was spent a lot of time as a young person in Rome before he was able to take his kingdom, before he was granted the kingdom by the Caesar. And so he is a vassal. He's a vassal king. He's a Roman puppet. Yeah, okay. And he winds up being the last of the Herods. Again, the Roman Revolution in 66, ending in 73. This brings the end to the Herods. This is the end of their dynasty. He's the final one. If you know your Herods. Now, regarding knowing your Herods, this is Bernice. Bernice looks a lot nicer than her brother Agrippa II. Again, we have her in 3 dimensions and in 2 dimensions. Now, regarding Bernice, holy smokes, I've been waiting now all my life for a movie, a mini-series, some kind of a special about her, because her life is a soap opera. It is extraordinary. She's flamboyant, and Josephus has some things to say about her. She's widowed at a very young age, and then after being widowed, she marries her uncle, who is yet another Herod. Well, she's got a dad who's a Herod. He's got a father who's Herod, a brother who's Herod, and an uncle who is also her husband, who is a Herod. But unfortunately, this husband died as well. Bernice is a bit of a black widow, apparently. I don't know. And so after the other husband dies, the second husband dies, she moves in with her brother, Agrippa II. And because the Jewish people are not that fond of Agrippa II, rumors abounded of the two of them living together as brother and sister, and maybe something more unnaturally intimate in their relationship, if you get my point, at least as far as Josephus tells us. And it's during this period of cohabitation that we meet both Agrippa and Bernice. So whether those are factual accusations or not, I don't know. I wasn't there. 4 years after this event, 63 AD, she wants to dispel the rumors surrounding her and her brother, and so she enters into a third matrimonial endeavor, this time to another king. At least she has her standards, right, after all. She marries royalty every time. And this king, for his part, he married Bernice for her money, right? And their partnership was short-lived. 3 years later, Bernice returns to the brother, Agrippa. But soon after, war breaks out. In the days of war leading to days of war, Bernice, remember, she's queen. She intercedes with the Roman government on behalf of her people. She puts her own life at great risk. But then after the destruction of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, Bernice meets Titus, who is the general who destroys the temple. And the moment she meets Titus, sparks fly, music plays, a love story for our time. Talk about Romeo and Juliet. Talk to West Side Story. This would be Far East Side Story, Mid East Side Story. You have the Roman general. You have the Jewish queen, married 3 times, whatever. She dumps the third husband, no third husband, and becomes the mistress of Titus, the general, who, upon the death of his father, becomes Caesar. So she is the mistress for a long time, goes to Rome to live in the vicinity, in the neighborhood of first the son of the emperor, and then later the emperor. They can't make a go of it because of politics. It would not be seemly for the emperor to be seen consorting with a Jewish queen of a vanquished, of a destroyed and conquered people. So they're forced to break up. She comes, she tries to see him again. He will not see her. Is his heart broken? Is her heart broken? Only the miniseries would have told me, but I'm still waiting for it. But nonetheless, you can imagine. It's all in Josephus. You can read about it. Very, very interesting. But nonetheless, that's Agrippa and Bernice. Bernice, we see her name in Lebanon. She's in Beirut. There is a ruin that actually has her name. She built this. Bernice Herod so she funded this, and her name lives on. Not just in infamy and in scandal, but she did a lot for the Jewish people at the time. Well, anyway, while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them, it's not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges," because Festus is so kind and so good at his job. "So after they had assembled here, I did not delay. And he didn't. He's conscientious. But on the very next day, I took my seat on the tribunal, which we just read about earlier, and ordered the man to be brought before me. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not as such crimes as I was expecting. I was expecting civil crimes. But they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. So at least Festus is getting the point here that Paul, the Christians, this is a subsect of Judaism at the time, and the specific issue is what those Jewish people, and of course Gentiles as well, what they thought about Jesus. Did Jesus come back from the dead, resurrection, i.e., or not? That's the crux, according to Festus. He's an uncomplicated man. These are the facts. These are the facts. Is the guy alive? Is that Paul says he's alive? These guys says he's not. They're not. He's not. And it's a religious issue that I really am out of my depth here. Being at a loss how to investigate such matters. I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there to stand trial in these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, as a Roman citizen, it was his right, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear from the man myself. This sounds very intriguing, especially if it has to do with Jewish issues. And I'm king, and I want to make sure that I know all the hot Jewish issues of the day, and maybe even knew some of those Jewish issues of the day. I would, because remember, when Jesus was crucified, Agrippa II is but a child. So he doesn't remember firsthand those things. But he did grow up seeing the Christian movement. But tomorrow, Festus says, you shall hear him. And to which I will say to you, in 2 weeks, you shall hear the defense of Paul before King Agrippa II and his sister, Queen Berenice. But regarding some closing thoughts, those who argue that those who speak from the pulpit should never venture into the realm of politics are obviously extremely ignorant of the New Testament accounts and the history of the church. I don't know if you've been paying attention throughout the book of Acts and going back to Jesus and his but a huge portion of the story that the Bible tells is political in nature. Politics through and through. And so if I were to avoid politics, I would avoid half the book of Acts and the entirety of the passion of our Mashiach, of our Messiah. Obviously, my hands are tied. I cannot do that. I will not do that. And so if I can speak about politics 2,000 years ago, then I dare say it's not that large a stretch to talk about politics today. And I simply want to say this. Paul is never shy, never reticent about using his rights, asserting his rights as a citizen of Rome to accomplish what he wishes to see. To A, protect him from being abused by the state. To B, advance the gospel. To C, to stymie his accusers and the agenda of those who would come against the gospel, Paul uses every ability that he legally has to advance his position. We can learn a lot from that. Those of us who want to shy away, particularly on a day such as today, when something that the church has been praying for and working toward diligently, with prayers, with perspiration, with effort, with blood, tears, has finally come to pass, by which I mean the abolition of Roe v. Wade, we should celebrate. We should, as our Attorney General has done, declare a holiday. If we can celebrate the emancipation of the slaves, the great moral issue of its day, then we certainly can celebrate the lives saved, the great moral issue of our day. And just as with the issue of slavery, I'm afraid regarding this issue, one cannot be neutral. It's very easy for us to see now in hindsight that there really is only one moral position regarding chattel slavery, and any other position regarding that is immoral. Chattel slavery either wrong or is acceptable. And there's no compromise between the two. If you do not see the era of slavery, then literally you simply don't get it. I don't know how people who had two different ideas about the acceptability of slavery 150 years ago, how they could live together in unity. Nobody said 150 years ago that diversity was our strength, because diversity is never a strength unless it's unity and diversity. Unity and diversity is always the strength, but it's the unity that makes the strength. Diversity, things diverse, the second law of thermodynamics comes into play. The center does not hold. The diversity tends to separate, scatter. There's no strength in that diversity. Becomes weaker and weaker. Unity, however, in diversity, there's strength. And just as 150 years ago, one could not straddle the fence between whether slavery was wrong or right, so too, we live in a day when I don't know what to do. I'm reading the news all last night. I'm reading the Facebook and the social media all morning. I'm seeing groups of people, senators, congressmen, saying to hell with the Supreme Court. They love it when the Supreme Court imposes their opinion. But when the Supreme Court has an opinion that differs, dissolve it. Insurrection, sedition. How do you live together as one people? You're going to tell me diversity is our strength? You having an opinion that killing babies is a good idea, an acceptable idea? And within that realm, there's a creeping movement toward later and later and later, until what? We're going to accept infanticide? Because the action's all happening now. Now everything's been thrown back to the states, where it should have been. and the people can speak. Right? And I do expect the people to speak. Texas has already spoken, as have other states. And there are other states that have spoken the other way. New York's not changing their opinions. California's not. Washington, Oregon, they're not changing their opinion. It's going to be a free-for-all for babies. How does one walk together as one united people? Here's a group that thinks baby killing is acceptable, abortion is reproductive health, and here's that a group that sees babies as people. Of course, if you can't define what a person is, then maybe things make sense. But nonetheless, how do two groups of people live in peace and harmony together with fundamental differences? You couldn't have a couple that believed one believes slavery is right, one believes slavery is wrong, right? How do you live together with such a moral conundrum? How do you live together with groups of people who shout, "Keep your religion out of my womb. It's all about me. It's all about women." Birthing people, because they can't define women anymore. It's now the women's movement and the birthing people's movements and whatever, How do you live together? How do you move forward as a nation together? It's a conundrum. It truly is a conundrum. And this to me is the major issue, but it's just one of other multiple issues that we are, as a culture, as a nation, in such fundamental disagreement that there really is, I don't see a way forward. So what happens? You separate, divorce, you have another civil war, one side forces its way on the other, and half the nation is walking around with red robes and white bonnets, say that we're terrible people. Or we live like we lived for the past 50 years, where 60 million babies were killed. Next week, it's July 4th weekend. And I'm going to be suspending the Jewish journey through the book of Acts. Next week, I'm leading worship. That gives me a certain level of freedom to arrange things as I see that we need to do. And so, after I lead worship, I am going to read the greater portion of the Declaration of Independence, because I believe that we need to be exposed to it. And I may actually do it on the early side so our children hear it as well, because I don't know that they hear it otherwise. Certainly I don't think they hear it in school anymore, unless they're homeschooled. And then we're going to spend the rest of the service praying for our nation. Because I don't have answers, political answers. I don't. I know right and wrong, as do you. I know what's abominable to the Lord, but I don't know how we go forward. And so when you don't know what to do, you seek a higher authority. Festus didn't know what to do. He gathered, let me consult with someone who may know better, Agrippa, and then Paul can consult Caesar, the highest law. Well, we need to appeal to the highest court in the land regarding our nation. And God God was willing to destroy Israel this morning. We saw it in Numbers 14. And as it was, he winds up not destroying, but every adult who rebelled against him bears the consequences of that rebellion, and they don't get to go into the promised land. So I want us to go forward in wisdom. I, as your leader, I'm not a seer. I'm not a prophet. So I want to ask you to pray with me and for me in our service next week, and for our congregation, so that we know as believers, in a world where protests are now bloody, violent, and potentially deadly, in a world and a nation where people scream to hell with not only the Supreme Court, with God, and cry out, "Hail Satan," which I read about this morning, we need to make sure that we are seeking the Lord's face. And so I know a lot of you have things going on next week for July 4th weekend, and there's barbecue opportunities and all kinds of things. Please, come, be with us on that morning, on July 2nd, next Saturday. And let's pray for our nation. Let's examine the Declaration of Independence. Let's remind ourselves of one of our founding documents, perhaps the most important founding document that we have. Square ourselves away. All right. That's enough of that. Let's go ahead and have some announcements.